Now to my exclusive one-on-one interview. I spoke earlier this week with the former Prime Minister John Howard. We spoke at length about the Queen's influence on Australia and the Commonwealth, as well as on him at a personal level.
A great leader, an impeccable constitutional monarch, somebody who had enormous affection for our country, and someone who always knew that she occupied the position she held by the consent of people. I found her in so many ways the most accomplished leader I dealt with in all my years in politics.
That is extraordinary given how long you were serving your own nation, but the sense of duty from Her Majesty was evident apparently from a very young age. What do you put that down to?
I think I put it down to the affection she had for her father and her mother, but particularly for her father because he was the monarch. I remember reading of the speech, I don't remember at the time, I was too young to be following those things, speech she made when she was 21, I think in South Africa, and said that her whole life, whether it be long or short, would be devoted to the service of what she called the great imperial family to which they all belonged. And she lived that commitment out to the week of her death, because only 2 days before she died, she received the resignation of the Prime Minister who served her, Boris Johnson, and on his recommendation commissioned Liz Truss to replace him. And in doing that, this is 2 days before she died, she was fulfilling the central constitutional duty of a Prime Minister in our system of government, and that is to preside, to give formality and to give legal imprimatur to a change of Prime Minister, but in no way to interfere with that choice. And it illustrated to me, and I'm sure to millions around the world, just what a good system of government we have, particularly when the person who sits at the apex of the system understands it, understands her role, both its symbolic and guidance strength, but also the fact that it is ultimately a monarchy governed by democratic principles.
And given the enormity of her contribution, did you ever pinch yourself, the boy from Earlwood, being at Buckingham Palace, having an audience with Her Majesty, the same monarch whose reign covered Prime Ministers all the way back to Churchill and Menzies?
Well, I guess I did. I was 12 when she came to the throne. I'm now part of that 14% of the Australian people who would have lived under the reign of one of those monarchs who went before her. So we're a diminished number, and a new count will start. But I do remember when she came to the throne, I remember all that. It was the beginning of 1952. I just started Canterbury Boys High School, just not far from where I grew up in Earlwood, and I remember it very vividly. I remember what Australia was like then. It was a great country. It's even greater now, but it was something that I vividly remember, all the important things, like we held the ashes then, as we do now. So that hasn't changed.
Well, that is a good thing. You and I share that common love of that great game. But you met Her Majesty on many occasions, I know, and a lot of them would have been informal settings. Can you give us a sense of what she was like in person?
Well, she had a great sense of humour. She was a lively conversationalist, and she had a wonderful sensitivity towards the different countries that called her queen. I remember my wife and I attended a dinner party at Holroyd Castle in Scotland at the time of a Commonwealth Prime Minister's meeting, and one of the other guests was the then Canadian Prime Minister, Jean Chrétien, who was a French Canadian. And halfway through the dinner, the Queen and Chrétien broke into talking to each other in French. Now, I mean, my French wasn't even of the schoolboy variety. I picked up a bit, but it was just the most natural thing in the world for her to do, and it was a gesture of her sensitivity. He was a native-born Prime Minister from Quebec, and his mother tongue was French, but his English was very good. Naturally, have to be a successful Canadian Prime Minister to be fluent in both. But point is that she was very rounded in her understanding of different countries, and she never lost sight of the fact that she was there by the consent of the people. And she would always be very well informed about Australian affairs. Whenever I saw her, she was across the recent political developments in Australia. This is when I was Prime Minister, and she would ask about them, but not in a way that represented any kind of interference, but she was very familiar with things that we had done and things we'd achieved and the challenges that the country had.
She paid 16 visits to Australia. She did seem to have a particular affection for our country. Would you agree with that?
Look, she did have a great affection, and of course she identified with so many of our pursuits. I think the last time I saw and talked to the Queen would have been at Windsor Castle in 2019, and part of the conversation surrounded that wonderful horse Winx, and of course her eyes lit up at any reference to horse racing, which she had a great love of it, and it was something that I must confess I did not have in common, but one or two of my predecessors certainly had in common with her that great love of horse racing, and that enlivened their relationship with her. But she knew a lot about Australia.
I know you gave a tip to Scott Morrison you gave Scott Morrison a good tip to give her a book about Winx.
I did, and she knew so much about the horse, and it wasn't just sort of a pro forma reference along the way. She knew quite a bit about the horse, and by natural inclination, probably more than I did. But that was emblematic of her curiosity about the countries that had her as their head of state, and she was very sensitive to these things, and it's just an illustration of how all-consuming was her commitment. Now, it is amazing that not only she lived for a very, very long time, 96 is an old age in anybody's language, but to the very end, as I've mentioned, she was carrying out her duties and doing her job. She had enormous respect around the world. She lived through the most colossal societal changes in Great Britain and in all countries that were connected with her. She saw the rise and fall when she became Queen in 1952. Joseph Stalin was still the murderous dictator of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would collapse in 1989, and obviously that brought about an enormous change around the world. She dealt with a variety of American presidents. I think probably Harry Truman was the still the President of the United States when she became Queen. And of course, memorably, Winston Churchill had come back as Prime Minister just before she became Queen. And I think Liz Truss is the 15th British Prime Minister, and Anthony Albanese is the 16th Australian Prime Minister of her reign. So she's been around for a long time, and her statecraft.
She has indeed.
Amazing.
Well, on that issue, can you give us a sense of how she was able to transcend politics? She was above it, wasn't she? Never engaged, but had that authority across the top. I guess that was central to her authority as Queen.
The authority she had was a full and complete understanding of both the strengths and also the limitations of the office. The strength of the office was that it was non-political. It wasn't, in our terms, Labor or Liberal. She had good relations with Harold Wilson, who was a long-serving Labor Prime Minister of Britain, and she had good relations, starting with Churchill and many Conservative Prime Ministers. And she behaved with complete propriety when Australia, unlike any other country that has her as Queen, had a full democratic vote as to whether she should continue when we had the referendum some 20 years ago. Now, she derived her strength from the restraint she always displayed in exercising her powers, and that drew a very positive response across the political spectrum. It's one of her enormous strengths.
Mr. Howard, you mentioned your wife a few times, that she was able to have an audience alongside you with Her Majesty. Can you give us a sense of what the experience was like for Jeanette, your wife, and what she thought of the Queen?
Well, obviously when I had any kind of formal audience, it was just the Queen and myself, as is appropriate, because I was her Australian Prime Minister, as Mr Albanese is her Australian Prime Minister, or was until this morning, Australian time. But Jeanette had very similar attitude towards her as I did, and there were quite a number of occasions where we were guests of her and her late husband, the Duke of Edinburgh, at various official functions. And she was, as I said earlier, a tremendous conversationalist. And I remember the very first time that I met the Queen as Prime Minister. I'd met her on a number of occasions before, and several times as a Leader of the Opposition on her visits to Australia. And this meeting, I had a formal audience in Windsor Castle a year after I'd been Prime Minister, and we then had a very pleasant lunch. And her mother was still alive, the Queen Mother, and her sister, Princess Margaret, was there as well. And they, all of them, but very particularly the Queen and her mother, exhibited this amazing understanding of Australia and a lively conversation. And Jeanette had a similar experience of being very, very impressed with just how knowledgeable she was, and therefore obviously how affectionate she was towards Australia.
And just finally, you as Prime Minister did attend the funeral of the Queen Mother. You've got a sense of what we should expect, but there is an enormous amount that will go into the farewell for Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth.
Oh, well, it'll be an enormous occasion. And she's been on the throne for more than 70 years. And I think it's fair to argue that after the Vatican, the Holy See, the British monarchy is the oldest institution in Western civilization. So it's quite a bit of history. And she's the longest serving monarch by quite a number of years. So it's an amazing event in the history of the United Kingdom, and a big event too in the history of countries like Australia. And I think there's probably been a bit of preparation already been put into it. And but the thing to remember is, most of all, is that we honour somebody today and in the days and weeks ahead who was faithful to some vows she took on her coronation, who lived to the full the promise she made at the age of 21 to serve until 2 days before her death. And that's a pretty impressive demonstration of the wonderful character that Elizabeth II had.
Former Prime Minister John Howard, I appreciate your time and your reflections on Her Majesty. Thank you.